Hi, I'm going to share with you about Acts 1, verses 1 through 14. And right now, I'm going to start by sharing some of the background to this passage. So, our passage today is the beginning of the book that's called the Acts of the Apostles. It's a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. And both of these books, Acts and Luke, are attributed to the beloved physician who was a firsthand eyewitness to the events. And he's mentioned in Paul's letters to the Colossians and in Paul's second letter to Timothy. Historians believe that at the very least, this material we're reading today might be from Luke's travel diaries, and that those are the main source for the book at minimum. But most scholars actually believe that Luke wrote this gospel himself, and also the Gospel of Luke. That's not true for most of the books of the Bible that are usually attributed to people that got those stories from the person that the book's attributed to, but not the person that it's attributed to didn't necessarily write it. Anyway, so in this case, Luke tends to tell the story as we and doesn't use the word I a whole lot, but he is talking about things that he saw himself. He uses we, scholars think, to express his sense of community with the other disciples who lived through the same things. The promise that this sense of community that he's expressing by using we is a gift of God's Spirit that will continue and grow is actually the main point of today's passage and of Luke and Acts as a whole. Jesus will pass on to his successors the Spirit which he has received from his Father. That's really the underlying theme of the Gospel of Luke and Acts. So reading Luke's Gospel and this book about the Acts of the Apostles together, they express two clear goals that run through both of them. First, the first goal of Luke and Acts is to defend the earliest followers of Jesus' way from accusations that are still all too familiar today, that they were destroying the traditions of their religious community, and that they were a politically divisive threat to national unity. And then, so defending themselves against those two charges is the first goal. The second goal of Luke and Acts is to awaken people's faith by showing the progress of the gospel in contrast to or in spite of those accusations of divisiveness and faithlessness. So it's a contrast between this is, people think we're tearing our religion apart, we're tearing our country apart, but in reality, look what God's Spirit is doing through us. Look at the acts of unconditional, infinite, freely given love, grace that are embodied not only in Jesus' life and teachings that we saw in the Gospel of Luke, but also in those of his followers who spread his message and follow his example. So that's what the Acts of the Apostles is about. So understand today's passage about the ascension, Luke 1, verses 1 through 14. It's all about the ascension. The ascension is an event. I don't know how you feel about it. Many of us, myself included, may have preferred to skip over that passage or that story over the years. It's one of the stories that if you're kind of a scientifically minded modern person that doesn't tend to read the Bible completely literally all the time, maybe the ascension may be a challenging story that hasn't had a whole lot of meaning for your faith up to this point. I know I wouldn't have chosen to preach on the ascension, but here it is in the lectionary. Right. So it could help us, if we're struggling with this passage at all, it can help us to remember that the spiritual goal of this passage, whether we read it as a common literary metaphor of its time and place, which it in fact was, or as a historical event, the underlying meaning really here is to express the progress of Jesus' message of unconditional love in word and deeds as the Christian community's answer to the popular charges against them that they were destroying religious and political unity. So we have to remember that even telling a story about ascension has that same goal to say, no, we're not trying to destroy our country. We're not trying to destroy our community of faith. We're trying to live a life of unconditional love together and with other people. So according to Luke, Jesus taught his apostles earlier in Luke chapter 6, for example, Jesus said, by their fruits you will know them. That was his teaching, Jesus' teaching to his apostles and to his disciples about how they're going to know who's really following him and who's not. So the early Christians in the book of Acts, and here even in this first chapter of Acts, modeled this for us. The way to counter charges that our way of faith is divisive of national and religious unity is just to point to the fruits our lives bear. And that's why the Acts of the Apostles recounts so many healings and acts of compassion. The sharing of goods in Acts 2:42, the peaceable way of life that runs through the whole Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, uh, the equality among members that runs through all of the Gospels, the letters, and the Acts of the Apostles. It talks about the way the early church was structured and who was, men and women leading it together in their homes and things like that. The liberation of those enslaved, the inclusion and even the commissioning to ministry of those who were usually excluded from the community of faith, like the Ethiopian eunuch, who actually became the first Gentile preacher. Who previously they're not dividing and excluding people; they're including people who usually got excluded by reason of race, gender, and so on and so forth. So they're really just showing this is what we do. You can say what you like about us dividing people, but in fact, we're including and growing. So there's very few apostolic sermons, but there's a lot about what they did. Wordy, angry counter arguments really are not the way of Jesus. They don't change hearts and lives. Actions do. Relationships do. So this isn't called the arguments of the apostles or the doctrines of the apostles. It's called the Acts of the Apostles. That's what we've been given to follow.